So on to now part 3. And so in part 3, we're going to explore gender in relation to social change, masculinities, and I'm going to talk about the plural form of that, and patriarchy. So let's think first of all about the evolution of gender. And gender socialization, as we've talked about, directs men and women and different people towards the performance, the doing of gender in particular ways, in particular roles, particular kinds of jobs in society. So this is not about individual behavior. This is about the social context in which we take up particular kinds of roles within, the social expectations that exist that produce gender in society. So let's think about how that has changed over time in Australian society. So in the past, this has often meant, for example, that within the family in Australian society, women were seen as housewives, that their main role was about taking care of the family, taking a nurturing role of looking after the children, making sure that they undertook the domestic work and so on. And men were seen as breadwinners, that is, that they took up the practice of having a job, paid labor, and being able to earn an income so that they could support their families financially, being the breadwinners. But none of this is static, and this is what's really important about the study of gender, is that it is a contested site of meaning, that there are patterns to be seen over time, but also that things are always changing for a whole range of different reasons. And sociologists are particularly interested in how structures in society shape the way that we see gender. So, how, for example, are changes in the economy and in society more generally reshaping the way that we think about gender. So let's think about some of the possible reasons for change, or some of the contributory things that have created change around the way that we understand gender. So first of all, there's been greater access to higher education, and that doesn't just come about. That's been through a lot of struggle over the 20th century for women's access to higher education. And as women gained access to higher education over the second half of the 20th century, that created change in gender expectations to some extent. And that, together with an evolving and changing labor market trending towards white-collar work, was also a contributory sort of factor in how gender has changed over time. Together with this, and we need to think about the relationship of gender to, for example, class. And you've just been thinking about class as well in this program. The expansion of the middle class also created new opportunities for women to move outside of the domestic sphere and to engage in higher education and also in paid work and to develop their careers. But of course, this is classed, so it's only some women who benefited from those changes around the expansion of the middle class. As well as this, there's been a decline in full-time permanent work with increased forms of casualization and less security. So the idea of a job for life has been undermined over decades. So that idea of a job for life very much underpins the idea of the male breadwinner. And as that has declined, increasingly two people need to work to be able to have enough income coming to families, again, creating opportunities for women to be able to engage in work. And that is also connected to the rise in the cost of living, cost of housing, and cost of education, all putting pressure on families to rethink gender roles in relationship to that idea that women should stay at home and take on the nurturing role of domestic unpaid labor while men undertook the role of the breadwinner. Also, changes such as having greater access to birth control and family planning, women having greater control over their reproduction and their bodies have all also contributed to changes in gender roles and gender expectations. And all of this, I would argue, has been largely driven by feminist pressure and activism for change. And we're going to think about feminism in all of its diversity, because we tend to think about feminism as this one thing, but actually feminism has lots of different approaches and perspectives. But over the 20th century and into the 21st century, there's been a lot of struggle for change. I talked about access to higher education as one example, but we're gonna look at the kind of evolution of feminist activism in relationship to change around gender in society towards the end of this lecture. So let's think about women's work. So women's full-time wages are still around only 80% of men's wages. And here's a little infogram about what that looks like. So, that's different by state and territory, interestingly. It's different by industry. On average, women earn about $255 per week less than men. On average, women's full-time weekly earnings are almost 1,600, whereas men's are 1,846. So there's still a big gap in women's wages to men's. Women workers are also concentrated in sales, service, clerical sectors, and also nursing and teaching. So there's still a division of labor in terms of the world of work. And these sectors are generally lower paid. So where women are concentrated, those sectors are also lower paid than sectors in which men are concentrated. And also women have fewer career opportunities within the sectors that they are concentrated, such as sales, service, and clerical sectors. So all of that contributes to this gap, this gender pay gap. And that, together with the fact that very few women occupy senior leadership and managerial positions compared to men. So all of that together means that we have this picture of an ongoing gender pay gap. Let's also think about gender segregation. So compared to other countries that share similar levels of affluence and educational standards, interestingly, Australia has high levels of gender segregation in both work and in leisure. And Australians tend to believe this is natural. And the reason that Australians tend to believe this is natural is because without access to perhaps the lens that sociology offers to start to defamiliarize the familiar, we get so taken up in our day-to-day practices and the normative construction of what is of what kind of societal expectations are, that it becomes almost seen to be natural, as a natural kind of phenomenon, that there are differences, that there is gender segregation. And so it's, when you look at other country contexts, it can be quite interesting and also enlightening to see that segregation isn't as profound. So for example, in Norwegian countries, And the work and leisure of men and women is valued differently in Australia as well, as we saw in the previous slide. So there is an ongoing kind of reproduction of gender segregation through the ways in which we apply value to the different kinds of labor that women and men tend to take up. So even if you think about domestic labor, which is unpaid labor, the value given that will be different to the value of being a CEO in a major corporation, for example. So that's quite a stark example of the different value. But if we think about the values that are provided to, things like being a teacher as opposed to being a doctor, for example, there are different kinds of social values attached to that, and that too is gendered. So let's think for a moment about the gender division of labor. So it's interesting that despite ongoing and kind of progressive educational success over the past decades, where women have been doing very, very well in accessing higher education and so on and completing their degrees, despite that, women often end up in jobs that are insecure, low paid, and low status. They often, so what's going on there? Well, women often take up such jobs so that they can continue to juggle family responsibilities and paid work. So the structures around family life, work life, and education are all interrelated. So if we look at these things in a detached ways, we can't see the patterns. If we start to see how families are structured against how work is structured, then we can start to develop sociological explanations of why there is a gender division of labor. And of course, this is cultural as well. So in Australian society, largely, men are not expected to make such sacrifices and adjustments. So, that plays into the ongoing reproduction of the gender division of labor. And, relatively speaking, as well, statistics show that Australian men do little housework and not as much childcare as women. So this is a recent December 2021 Guardian article that says that women do 21 hours more unpaid work than men a week, according to a national survey. So, this is not, this doesn't seem to be changing. This doesn't seem to be shifting. So sociologists are also interested in the cultural expectations that that reproduce the kinds of practices that we take up, like women taking lower paid work or insecure contractual roles in order to make sure that they can juggle the unpaid work that they do in the home, for example. So let's think for a moment about the relationship of all this to masculinities. And it's really important that this has a plural, because masculinity is problematic in the sense that it doesn't grasp the different forms in which masculinity can be taken up, and that there are some forms that carry more status and esteem than other forms of masculinity. So Connell argues that masculinities come into existence at particular times and places and are always subject to change. So we've already seen that with gender more broadly. So as gender changes, so do masculinities change. And dominant definitions of masculinity are embedded in social institutions. So in the same ways we've looked at that in relation to gender more broadly, so is masculinity constructed within social institutions, such as education, such as the family, such as work, such as education, and so on. So in order to study masculinities, we need to think about the different images, the different texts, the different practices that construct masculinity. So we're not as interested in individual personality or behavior as those broader kinds of social practices that different forms of masculinity are associated with. So hegemonic masculinity is a really important concept because what it helps us to see is that there are particular forms of masculinity that are privileged in society and that carry with them power. So this is not just about individual men having power. This is about how particular ways of being a man carries power with it. And it carries power with it because it's institutionalized in our social structures and ideologies that support gender difference and gender power in favor of men in general, but in favor of hegemonic masculinity in particular. Because not all men directly benefit from the ideals of hegemonic masculinity. In order to benefit from hegemonic masculinity, you need to take up hegemonic masculinity in particular ways and in particular social contexts. What does hegemony mean? Hegemony is a really important sociological concept, which is not exactly the same as dominance, because dominance is something that's more static, and hegemony is something that is able to think about the struggles in which something becomes privileged in society, and that's shifting all the time. It doesn't stay static, and that it is through consensus that something becomes hegemonic. It's not through force. It's not through a kind of a very oppressive form of binary power, but it's through a dynamic in society that certain ways of being or certain constructions of being become more privileged or carry more power. So let's think about some examples of that. So examples like the ways we think about what a leader should be, and who can be seen as taking up leadership. And leadership tends to be underpinned by a particular view of hegemonic masculinity, about making tough decisions, about being strong, about being effective, about being able to convince other people of a way forward, and so on and so forth. Whereas caring forms of leadership or nurturing forms of leadership or distributed forms of leadership don't carry the same hegemonic status. So here's some examples of some of the kinds of hegemonic masculinities that we're familiar with. So, the soldier, the image of the soldier is a familiar hegemonic masculinity that we would recognize. A form of athleticism or sportsmanship is another form of hegemonic masculinity that's recognizable. The kind of political leadership that Donald Trump signified is another form of hegemonic masculinity that doesn't necessarily include some of the things that might be associated with femininity, like compassion or empathy, or caring about others, and so on. So these are stereotypes. They're not things that people easily just fit into, but they're ways of, they're traits that are recognizable, that are familiar, that might shape the way that we understand masculinity in society, and may even be seen to be toxic in their effects on how we experience our personhoods, whether we're male or female or non-binary. So it's important, as I said, that masculinity is understood to always be contested. So this is not something that's static. And hegemony is a really important concept to be able to express, that this is not something that is static. This is something that is struggled over, to be privileged, to be valued, that's responsive to trends and social movements, that is kind of fluid and dynamic in relationship to societal expectations and changes. And it's also really important to say that very few men actually occupy hegemonic masculinity, that are, these kinds of images or constructions that are celebrated in popular or particular culture. But through the ideals of hegemonic masculinity, men are not only organized hierarchically in relation to women, but also in relation to each other. So where there is this kind of hegemonic masculinity, which is, again, not about a particular person, but a particular idea of masculinity, that has consequences for other forms and expressions of masculinity that don't carry the same value, esteem, status, or privilege. And men who are read as effeminate, or whose gender and sexuality differ from hegemonic standards, will often experience marginalization because of the power of hegemonic masculinity. But Connell does argue in the analysis of masculinity that all men do receive some measure of the patriarchal dividend, what's called the patriarchal dividend, even if they are implicitly excluded from the ideals of hegemonic masculinity. So therefore, when we think about gender, we have to have quite a nuanced understanding of how it actually plays out in lived experience, that it's not this static thing, it's not a binary, it's not something that people have, it's something that people construct through what they do. And it has different impacts on different bodies in the way that bodies are constructed, viewed, perceived, and how those bodies take up different forms of masculinity and femininity. So let's think about this idea of the patriarchal dividend. So the modern gender order is based on this idea of the patriarchal dividend, in which women remain subordinate to men. Patriarchy benefits different people in different ways around hegemonic masculinity. So an example of this is in relation to the gender division of labor, that men collectively receive the bulk of income in the money economy, as we've already seen in the gender pay gap, and occupy most of the senior leadership and managerial positions in which they can influence policy, they can influence decision making, they can also influence the construction of gender itself, arguably. And worldwide, men hold 9 out of 10 cabinet level positions in national governments, nearly as many parliamentary seats, and most of the top positions in international agencies. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. This is, where the patriarchal dividend really shows benefit. And men also receive the benefits of a great deal of unpaid households labor and emotional support from women. So, as we've seen, where the gender division of labor in the domestic sphere is unequal. And this is particularly the case in heterosexual relationships, where women carry out the majority of domestic unpaid labor and childcare. So patriarchy is not exclusively defined as relations between individual men and women. So what's important about sociology, again, it's about structure. So if we think about patriarchy as a structure, and not so much about individuals, but it impacts on individual lives. but it impacts on individual lives because it's a structure that that sort of, you know, has implications for different personal choices, different personal actions and practices, and also the ways that those structures constrain and often oppress different individual people. So there's always this relationship between the individual and the structural. So our personal experiences are always shaped in a sociological way by the wider structures, and patriarchy is one of those important structures according to gender theory. So it's really important that sociologists don't look so much at the individual level, but look at the symbols, the language, the patterns that shape individual lives. And gendered socialization, hegemonic masculinity, essentialist views of biological gender traits all contribute, when brought together, to the ongoing structure of patriarchy and its, you know, its powerful position in our social institutions. But that doesn't mean that women can't gain power in patriarchal systems by their association with or inheritance from powerful males, and also by taking up the practices of hegemonic masculinity. So, you know, it's really important to understand that the idea of doing gender helps us to see that all sorts of different bodies can take up hegemonic masculinity, but it's also the way in which those bodies are perceived. So there's a constant sort of relationship between the way we're perceived by others and the practices that we take up, and those perceptions are formed within social structures, within social institutions, and within patriarchal structures. So patriarchy is a really helpful lens to think about how gender is reproduced over time in societies. However, it has also been critiqued for perhaps not thinking so well about the intersectionality of inequalities, of oppression, of difference. So, you know, we need to think about patriarchy as, again, something that is fluid and dynamic rather than as monolithic, and the way that patriarchy might, for example, intersect with other structures of inequality like racism or neocolonialism or heterosexism or ableism, you know, and we can think about a number of different structural inequalities at play that play out with gender inequalities. Okay, so that's the end of part 3, and I'll be back in a moment with part 4.